All right, let's look at how many Pennsylvania adults need to be fully vaccinated before the state lifts its mask mandate. Right now, about 4.2 million have both shots. That's about 42% of adults. So another 2.8 million will need to get vaccinated in order to reach the 70% threshold. Channel 11's Gabriella DeLuca live after talking to one local doctor about whether he believes we can reach that 70%. Gabriella.
David, the governor says that 70% of people who are vaccinated is the figure that we all need to meet. But a local infectious disease doctor says he believes that we can start taking our masks off at a much lower number.
The governor saying that he will end the mask mandate at 70% is kind of a carrot and stick approach.
Infectious disease expert Dr. Amesh Adalja says it may be a while before our state is 70% vaccinated.
The biggest obstacle the United States faces right now in getting vaccine into arms is not supply, it's actually demand.
Governor Wolf announced yesterday that once we reach 70% of Pennsylvanians who are fully vaccinated, the mask mandate will finally be lifted. As of today, 42% of people in our state are fully vaccinated, and almost 51% of people have received their first dose, which Dr. Adalja thinks could be close enough to drop the mask mandate. He's basing that off data in Israel.
Israel has vaccinated about 54% or so of their population, but when they cross the 40% threshold of fully vaccinated, of a fully vaccinated population, 40% of their population fully vaccinated, is when they started to see a precipitous decline in cases.
But according to Adalja, the hardest part our state faces right now is getting people to get the vaccine.
We've got some part of the population that will not go near that vaccine no matter what. Then there are people on the fence, people who have questions, people who are procrastinating. All of that is adding up to a very difficult vaccine rollout.
We also learned from the state today that teens who are 18 years and younger who receive the vaccine are not included in vaccination rates. Reporting live, Gabriella DeLuca, Channel 11.